In Paul Kennedy's exploration of World War II, Engineers of Victory, he poses the key question that faced the Allies once the US joined the war. How does one achieve one's strategic aims when one possesses considerable resources but does not, or at least not yet, have the instruments and organizations at hand? His answer was that the most important variable of all was, quote, the creation of war-making systems that contained impressive feedback loops, flexibility, a capacity to learn from mistakes, and a culture of encouragement that permitted the middlemen in this grinding conflict the freedom to experiment, to offer ideas and opinions, and to cross traditional institutional boundaries. Today, we're going to check in with the perfect guest to discuss just how the Defense Department's culture of encouragement is doing nowadays, Chris Kirchhoff.
Chris in 2023 wrote, to the extent present military and civilian leadership is articulating a strategy, it is one built for the most part on a continuation of previous programmatic and budgetary trend line. If there is a strategy for losing a future war in China, this is it. Chris recently published a book called Unit X, which traces the evolution of the DIU, a group of Pentagon insurgents. Chris was part of the DIU founding team and previously worked on a number of national commissions as well as in the Obama NSC. Chris, welcome to ChinaTalk.
Great to be here.
Let's start with the origin of the DIU. What was Ash Carter's vision and what was the V1 version?
Well, it's a wild story, and it actually begins before Ash became secretary, when everyone at the Pentagon was really wowed by the revolution in commercial technology that we were witnessing in the 2010s. So, smartphones, Google, and some of the more curious leaders in in the Pentagon started wanting to go visit Silicon Valley and understand more about, cloud computing and social networks. And so one of my first jobs when I went to work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey, was to organize a trip for him to Silicon Valley. And Marty Dempsey is an extraordinary leader and really curious. And so he ever since he was a 3-star general, he had what he called his campaign of learning, which was rooted in his view that an essential part of leadership was always staying curious and continually learning new things about the world. And so we flew out to Silicon Valley, and we ended up doing a number of events there. At the first event, a breakfast with Vint Cerf, the co-founder of the internet, and a number of other very prominent Silicon Valley figures, General Dempsey announced that, I'm here in my campaign of learning, and the way this works is that if I don't learn something, Chris gets fired. So I took note of that. But what's most memorable about the trip, and I think most important to what comes after in terms of Defense Innovation Unit, is the visit that we had at Google later that morning. And we got a chance to meet with Astro Teller, the head of Google X, who at that time was in the middle of the self-driving car project, which, of course, today we know as Waymo, the taxi company. And Astro had, at the general's request, briefed the car project. And in fact, one of the test cars, a Toyota Prius with the LiDAR radar dome on top, was downstairs parked next to our motorcade. And at the end of the visit, as we were walking back to the motorcade, General Dempsey wanted to actually look at the car. And Dempsey, under no circumstances was he supposed to get in the car and ride around, right? I mean, he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We got the security team. He's got to, have his communicators with him. So if the president needs to call, there's an emergency, they pre-plan the routes he takes. And so what did General Dempsey do? He said, I want to go for a ride. And so there we are. I'm standing on the sidewalk. General Dempsey's getting in the back seat of a Toyota Prius and driving out of the Googleplex. I'm thinking, I'm going to be fired. There's no way I'm not going to be fired by the end of this car ride for letting the general actually drive away. So, the security guys jump in their Suburbans. They race after the Toyota Prius. And he comes back from a 15-minute ride where he watched that Toyota Prius navigate fully autonomously, including maneuvering around a biker in the bike lane. And he asked a really astute question to the engineers. He said, tell me, all this hardware that you have on the Prius that allows it to do self-driving, how much does that cost? And they said, well, sir, it cost about $3,000. And you could just see this light bulb go off in Dempsey's head that this revolution in microelectronics and lower cost consumer devices wasn't just about smartphones and new toys. It was also going to be something that was very quickly going to impact the military as well.
Yeah. As I think I've talked about this on the show in the past, like my first Waymo ride, which I guess was 2 years ago now in Phoenix, there's something about I know you've recently worked at Anthropic for a little while, Chris, about the LLMs, which are magic, but like having the magic like embodied and like move you around is like a different type of awakening, I think. I don't know, like when you sort of think back about the various revolutions in military affairs across history where there were some people who got it and some people who didn't. I wonder if there are like different types of innovations, or like what do you see as like the trend line between the people who understand what the future is coming and the ones that struggle to get out of the contemporary paradigm that they've grown up in professionally?
Well, I think you have to be very, modest. It's very easy to look at the current chapter of innovation that we're in, a push towards Silicon Valley, trying very hard to link the consumer technology ecosystem and system of production to the military system of production, which is entirely separate for the most part, as being a unique feature of today. But the more military history you read, books like Sharon Weinberger's Imagineers of War, A History of DARPA, the more you realize what a deep continuity there is with the past. It turns out that, this is not the first push towards trying to integrate the leading modalities of modern engineering in Silicon Valley with the military. But it's probably different in that the scale of these two innovation ecosystems are very different. So, today's consumer technology market is a $25 trillion market. The Pentagon buys a lot of stuff, but we're talking billions, not trillions. So never before, I think, has the commercial innovation ecosystem been so much larger than the defense ecosystem, which is, of course, part of the generational shift that Ash Carter was one of the first to both spot and then act upon.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about sort of the 80s and 90s and precision targeting, like it wasn't the DoD like pushing shrinking nodes, right? But the sort of relative balance of size of the two R&D ecosystems was much more similar than it was, than it is even today.
Yeah, and that brings us to Ash Carter, who is, of course, just seminal to the story of Defense Innovation Unit. And as we talk about in the book, when he was Professor Ash Carter in 2001, he wrote a very important article called Keeping the Technological Edge. And in that article, he hypothesized, correctly that the growth of the commercial technology ecosystem in the 1990s and 2000s was on a trajectory that was going to quickly make it so much larger than the defense ecosystem that it simply couldn't be ignored. And in the post-Cold War era, when the department was itself, along with the whole federal government, drawing down research and development funding compared to its height, Ash, in that 2001 article, realized that the department needed to shift into a whole new mode of being a fast follower, of going from the institution that used to be generations ahead of technology and the consumer market to facing a consumer market that would have technology generations ahead of what was being produced in defense labs. And so he saw this very clearly in 2001, and very shortly after becoming secretary, moved to do two very important things: create first the Defense Innovation Board, and then second, Defense Innovation Unit.
Yeah, I mean, I love these series of stories you have where Raj Shah visits a command center in 2016 that it was as if the military had resigned itself to becoming a display in the Museum of Computer History. Trey Stevens, of course, who went on to co-found Anduril, started his career in the intelligence community. And he said that 20% of my time was merging database files. I thought I was going to show up and it would be a James Bond thing. They'd give me a supercomputer and the keys to an Aston. Instead, it was a joke. And, there's a number of other VCs who like go on these sort of like hang out with special forces. Like they try to work out for 2 weeks to like get in shape. And, at the end of it, they're just like, I can't believe these guys are using Palm Pilots or whatever. So you have that in the sort of mid 2010s, and there was this first effort to set up a new outpost in Silicon Valley. So I think the most interesting part of DIU version 1.0 was that like the sort of that the plug was pulled out of it in the first place, and that there ended up being a reset. So oftentimes like things just like muddle through in Washington or the Defense Department, and you don't necessarily have people early enough do the sort of like fail fast mindset and try to reset things. So looking back on that part of the story, Chris, what do you think was the driver for you and Raj ultimately to get brought into this?
Well, I think it goes really back to leadership, and Ash Carter is a serious guy. He's a guy that didn't miss much, and when he first heard that his little innovation experiment out in Silicon Valley might not be succeeding in the way that he had hoped, he didn't just take note of that. He actually sent Todd Park, an extraordinary entrepreneur himself, to go investigate, to go take a firsthand look at what was happening, and that really says something about how Ash approached his job as secretary, not leaving anything unnoticed. So I really credit Ash for then when he realized that Defense Innovation Unit was in its initial incarnation not set up to succeed, for going back to the drawing board or the whiteboard, as it may be, and starting anew and really taking a step back and thinking, okay, we really need this to work. So how can we get it to work?
So can you tell the story at the very beginning when you guys are both at like the point of like maximum leverage, I guess, and the sort of, quote unquote term sheet that you ended up crafting to set DIU on a path where it could potentially succeed?
Yeah, it was interesting when Secretary Carter and Todd Park approached Raj and I about potentially the two of us being involved in the reboot of DIU. We'd each watched the first team really struggle. I remember visiting them on a trip to Silicon Valley with Vice Chairman Silva, and literally seeing the sitting on folding card table chairs for our briefing, and thinking to myself, gosh, I'm really glad I didn't come out and go to work at DIU, because this place is just not quite there yet. So Raj and I had a really careful think about what would be the conditions of success, and we realized we needed a couple things. First of all, we really needed the imperature of the Secretary of Defense. We needed his personal commitment to our unit, because we knew exactly how difficult some of the internal struggles were going to be. And so it was very important to us that rather than having a reporting chain that would kind of bury us under a number of layers, that we end up working very closely with the secretary and his staff. And so that was part of the term sheet that we talk about in the book. The other thing that was really important to us is there's a lot of rules and regulations in the department, as you can imagine. You have a department that has 3 million employees and 3 military departments, 4 military services. it's a giant place, and it accretes rules and regulations like you would expect a large mega institution to. And we knew that because our mission was deliberately set up against the grain of the institution. In other words, by definition, DIU was being set up because the institution itself was failing at the task of bringing commercial technology in. And it wasn't failing for no reason. It was failing because it wasn't architecturally set up to ingest commercial technology easily. So we knew from the beginning that this was going to be an uphill battle of extraordinary proportions, and indeed, it turned into that. And so the other really important item we put on our term sheet was something called waiver authority. And this is something that was kind of itself a very new idea in the department. And the idea behind it was if you bumped into a policy or procedure, not a law, you can't violate the law. Congress sets the law. But very little actually of what the department does is governed strictly by laws. Most of it is governed by internal procedure. So waiver authority is this idea that if you run into an internal procedure or policy that is getting squarely in the way of your mission, you can request that for your purposes and for the greater good, it be waived. And under the policy we set up with Secretary Carter, the owner of that policy had 14 days to handle a request for a waiver. And if they declined to waive that policy in 14 days, it would go immediately to Secretary Carter for review. And this was an incredible bureaucratic weapon because somebody who just wanted to kind of get in our way because either they didn't like what we were doing or they literally wanted to spite us, now all of a sudden would have to answer for their decisions to the Secretary of all Defense. And so that waiver authority ended up being, without question, the most important early tool we had at DIU.
Yeah, I mean, it's really striking that waiver authority and OTAs, which a enterprising young employee of yours kind of like helps resuscitate from the bowels of the NDAA, are basically like ways to not do things how everyone else does them. And it's thinking back, Chris, like to what extent would any of these rules you keep if you could start from scratch?
Well, the challenge in any public sector institution is that you can't really start from scratch, right? I mean, our government is, one that doesn't allow experimentation easily, by design, actually. There's a great James Q. Wilson book, a famous political scientist, called Bureaucracy. And the opening vignette in that book is James Q. Wilson, who at that time was a professor at Harvard, standing at a corner in Massachusetts where on one side there was a McDonald's and on the other there was a Department of Motor Vehicles. And he asked the question, why is it that the customer experience at McDonald's is so much more pleasant than the DMV? And of course, it has to do with the ways in which we set up public institutions. But nevertheless, at Defense Innovation Unit, we try to do all we can to look afresh at what was in the realm of the possible. And we had this kind of funny phrase among our cohort of change agents. Just legal enough. Okay, can we do acquisition faster? Is it legal? And it turns out there's often an enormous amount of distance between the strict letter of the law and where practice is. And so it turns out there's often a lot of ground to exploit. And the most incredible story in many respects of all of Defense Innovation Unit we tell in the book is the one you just referenced about Lauren Daly, a 29-year-old acquisition professional, comes from an Army family. Her father was a tank driver. And her way of serving was to become a civilian in the Pentagon and an acquisition expert. And because Lauren is a complete acquisition nerd, she stayed up late reading the text of the just passed National Defense Authorization Act and found a single sentence put there deliberately by a Senate staffer in Section 815 that she realized would change the way that OTA contracting could be done. So the sentence allowed the immediate conversion of a successful OTA pilot into a production contract. And this really was a game changer because, before, if you were a firm and you got an OTA, an easier kind of contract to administer, there was no real path to go from the one-off technology pilot you did to something at scale. And so Lauren, knowing this, brought the idea to our attention. And I'll be damned, we told Secretary Carter about it. I flew with Lauren to the Pentagon. We met first with the lead acquisition policy official. We then met with the lead acquisition lawyer. We then met with the general counsel of the Department of Defense. And in just over 2 weeks, we got everyone to agree on a whole new process for letting OTAs, we called the Commercial Solutions Offering, or CSO. And that allowed DIU to crack the hardest problem we faced, which is how to let contracts at Silicon Valley speed.
We're recording this July 3rd. Everyone across the entire executive branch is wringing their hands about what Chevron is going to do for them. Have you put any thought into this, Chris? Is this like just the change the DoD needed in order to get rid of some of its shackles, or is your sense that it's more of a mindset thing where if you can kind of like setting congressional action aside, if you can get more people into the just legal enough mindset, then there's still a ton of room to run and being more creative on bringing emerging technology into the system?
Well, I'm no lawyer. I think Chevron will be so much more disruptive for regulatory agencies. I would be interested to learn along with you what its exact implications are for the Department of Defense. But again, it's a general reminder that institutions tend over time to accrete rules and procedures that might not necessarily always serve the goals that they're trying to tackle as goals evolve in time. And it's a great reminder for leaders to pay attention to what they can do to discard the old as they're trying to do the new. And Defense Innovation Unit, of course, was a deliberate experiment to just see how far we could press and get with that as our mindset.
Yeah. It's interesting. You sort of point on the DoD side to this sort of internal vetocracy where, like, in order to do something, like, you actually need 20 people to, like, not be upset at you. And this is a theme that you see across a lot of different corners of the U.S. government. When it comes to permitting for data centers or what have you. There's just like a lot of places in the system where someone, if they're not won over to your vision, can stop it. I don't know, like the sort of theory of success that you guys needed in order to go anywhere required the top person to be very bought in. And I guess, thinking over the arc when there's been, different levels of enthusiasm at the secretary level for these types of, the type of vision and innovation the folks at DIU were pushing. I'm curious, like, thoughts on like the balance of having to deal with the rest of the bureaucracy without necessarily, the secretary writing, having your back in every night fight.
One of the funniest stories from the first couple months of DIU was Ash Carter, as we talk about in the book, was very conscious of how many days left he would likely have as secretary, and he wanted each day to make progress, which meant that he really moved fast sometimes. And we say in the book it sometimes felt like whiplash, and it did. And so one of the early episodes of Whiplash was, Raj and I had just been appointed by Ash Carter and named as the new leaders of Defense Innovation Unit. And literally before I was even unpacked and living in California, we got a call from Ash's front office and said the secretary is making a visit to Boston. We of course had talked about before opening a second branch of DIU in Boston, a biotech hub and innovation center of its own right. The secretary is traveling there in 3 weeks. We would love to open a Boston office in 3 weeks. And so we kind of said, okay, let's see what's in the realm of the possible. Let's see how much progress we can make. And then the secretary's office said one more thing. They said, and by the way, we know that we talked about it was important to get a charter, an official charter for Defense Innovation Unit that set out your authorities ratified so that you would be kind of street legal within the system of entities in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And so before I know it, I'm in the basement of the Pentagon on some corridor I've never been in after working there for years, in the room with 5 or so civil servants who had all served in the department for a very long time. And they ran the office, because it turns out there's an office that is solely dedicated to writing charters for OSD entities. And they have a very elaborate process by which they will help you write your charter. They'll help you circulate it to every other entity in the department. I mean, hundreds of entities, any one of which can object to any authority or stated provision you set out in your charter. And so I'd come down there to say, the secretary is traveling to Boston in 3 weeks. He's asked us to open an office, a second branch of DIU there, and he would like, when he's in Boston, to announce our charter as having been ratified. And so I asked, a key question after I got this long monologue about the involved process for how you get a charter done. And keep in mind, we'd already drafted it at this point. And I asked, well, what's the fastest you've ever put a charter together? And they said, oh, well, there was one time, in the middle of war, in the middle of the Iraq War, that we were able to get JIADO's charter. This is the Joint IED Defeat Organization, taken on the most serious source of American casualties in the Iraq War. They'd managed to get the JIADO charter done in 18 months. And they looked at that as, a kind of land speed record. And so I had to say, in a really uncomfortable way, the secretary has asked me personally to make sure that he's able to announce this in 3 weeks. So what do you think? And they, insisted that this is simply not possible. And I, one of them actually raised their voice a little bit, and I had to raise my voice in response a little bit and say, well, I will be walking up after this meeting to the secretary's office, and I'm happy to inform him. And I got the name of the individual. We'll call her Cheryl. I'm happy to, Cheryl, to personally tell the secretary that you, Cheryl, say that this is simply not possible. Is that the message that you would like, for me to walk upstairs? So you can imagine, ruffling feathers like this is both uncomfortable but also necessary. Now, how did the story end? Did we have our charter ready by Boston? No, we didn't. But you know what? We had it ready not too many weeks after the Boston office opened. So that tells you what leadership can do. And I think if you want to see what the absence of leadership does, we've already actually run the empirical experiment on that. And so if you look at what happened to DIU in the years after Secretary Carter departed, you see it really begin to struggle, and quite quickly, even though it did have a lot of support at the top, particularly under Secretary Mattis. And so that does tell you, I think, in public institutions, especially, leadership is absolutely essential.
Back to the charter story, how much can AI just solve all the paperwork?
Well, this is worth unpacking, right? I was sitting just a few weeks ago with one of the OSD officials in charge of AI. And he was telling me, for gosh sakes, can you imagine an OSD policy, an office that spends most of its time writing, staff update emails in a template format, writing briefing memos, writing reports. Can you imagine if we had ChatGPT at our desktop or another LLM, how much faster we could just work internally? Forget LLMs to actually help us win wars. Just LLMs to help us write emails, right, would really help the institution. But of course, even though we now have an entire new office, the CDAO, the Chief Digital AI Officer's Office, and a CIO, it's still remarkably difficult to make IT work in the public sector, evinced by the fact that any employee of a Fortune 100 company very likely has a suite of tools at their desktop. And, in theory, people in OSD policy do as well, because the Pentagon has decided to build a bespoke, custom, just for the Department of Defense, AI interface, a platform that on it, amalgamates a number of different AI tools for people to use. And so we have, again, rather than buying something off the shelf, like every Fortune 100 company in the country, and simply using easily available, inexpensive commercial services, we've made the problem for ourselves harder. And at least when I visited a few weeks ago, that employee in OSD policy, a very high-ranking one, didn't have access at their desktop to a tool that most Americans do. So we still have a long way to go in the department.
I'm going to play a clip from a show I did a few months ago with Garrett Bernstein.
In my perspective, having done this for a bunch of years now, that sort of group of folks in the department are so stretched, just trying to keep the lights on and get paper out the door, that they, taking on a new thing that's going to be innovative and cool and save them time, they're kind of like, I don't know if I've got time to do that. And the second thing is they've probably been around the department for a while, or any agency, if I'm sort of generalizing, and they've seen a ton of waves of this before. They've seen a lot of these, we're going to modernize everything with X new tool 15 years ago. They saw when email rolled out, they were told this is going to make everything easier. And actually it's made their lives, an endless responding to email.
Let's go a little sci-fi for a second, where you can kind of embody the sort of mindset or view of an office or person. And at least in the State Department context, where we were talking with Garrett a few months ago, the idea of getting cable sign-offs, sort of autonomously from all of these different agencies to be able to input their views in, is something to just radically accelerate sort of bureaucratic paper pushing. Also the idea of an AI writing a NEPA report or something being exciting. So beyond just having ChatGPT able to give you 4 paragraphs on what's going on in Pakistan, are there other 2025, 2026 sort of back office type applications of the current trajectory of artificial intelligence that you're particularly excited about, Chris?
Well, I'm sure there's many, and my greatest hope is just that the Department of Defense seizes the opportunity to experiment with AI and ultimately to use it at scale as fast as major American corporations are already today experimenting with AI, increasing their productivity, making it easier for their employees to do knowledge work. I think this is an incredible opportunity for the department. But, again, DIU was created for a reason. And there's a beautiful quote in the opening of our book from Chris Brose, the longtime staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee and now head of strategy for Anduril. And Chris observes that, the Department of Defense in the last 20 years, missed the transition to modern software methods, missed the turn towards mobile computing, missed the turn towards cloud computing, missed the turn towards artificial intelligence, and certainly also missed the commercial space revolution. So the track record, isn't great. And so that, I think, should be foremost of mind of not only the current secretary and deputy secretary, but the next several, as they try and change that track record and manage to get ahead of the technological revolutions to come, rather than finding those technological revolutions overwhelming not only our institution of the Department of Defense, but certainly the forces it deploys forward.
So thinking about those different technologies, I want to come to a framework that was laid out by Mike Horowitz, who's now doing emerging technology in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He has this, he wrote a book before his current term of service, where he had a little 2x2 about the level of organizational capital required to implement a major military revolution, and then the level of financial intensity required to implement a major military innovation. And basically, like, if it is easy and expensive, then this is something that the U.S. or the sort of the top dog is particularly well suited to doing. But if it is, if you're in other quadrants where you don't need a lot of money, or you sort of really need to reimagine your current bureaucratic infrastructure, then it is much more difficult for the current leading global power.
I really admire Michael Horowitz's scholarship. I think his work on innovation adoption is absolutely essential reading. In fact, we cite it in Unit X. I think, though, that 2x2 matrix you mentioned is itself, I think, set in a particular time. The reality today, as we're learning so brutally in Ukraine, is inexpensive technology is actually quite potent and powerful. And I think what's perhaps more relevant than the size of investment is sort of whether that investment needs to happen through traditional channels of budgeting that the department is very comfortable with, or whether it has to happen in channels that are new and different that maybe the department is not as comfortable with. And so, in other words, it's really easy for the Navy to buy another aircraft carrier. They know how to do that. They've been doing that for a long time. There's a very small number of suppliers. There's a very set schedule of getting something like that through Congress. But you're right. At smaller levels, I mean, what if you want to buy 1,000 drones and experiment with them? Which category of money and funding and which program office is the place that does that? And, it could be that there isn't one, and you actually have to create it. So I do think technology, the shifts in technology that we've seen have thrown us into a place where a lot of the department's traditional processes are simply not applicable. And that's very uncomfortable for the institution. But of course, the danger is that if you ignore that, you do so at your peril, because you'll, for every day you're not fixing that and addressing that, you're falling further behind the technology power curve. The person that gave DIU X its name was Bob Work, the incredibly pioneering deputy secretary who was the first as deputy secretary to really put his finger on what a crisis we were in technologically through his work on the third offset strategy and the advanced, the ACDP, the Advanced Capabilities and Deterrence Panel. And Bob came up with this wonderful phrase that in a way sums up Mike's incredible scholarship, which is that the department doesn't have an innovation problem. It has an innovation adoption problem. There's plenty of incredible technology floating around the department, places like DARPA, now at places like DIU as well. But getting it to work at scale is not something the department does well.
The sort of innovation versus diffusion balance is something we talked a lot about on ChinaTalk, and the concepts, thinking about U.S. and China AI broadly, but the sort of all the institutional barriers we've been talking about for the past 45 minutes that make it harder in the department are particularly scary, especially when you're, we have a case study now of just what it's taking to for Ukraine to fight to a draw. I want to sort of throw two more quotes at you. The first clip is Bill LaPlante, who's the most important acquisitions leader in the Defense Department, and the second is Alex Wong, CEO of Scale AI.
Ukraine is not holding their own against Russia with quantum. Okay, they're not holding their own with AI. They're not whatever your favorite gadget is. It's hardcore production of really serious weaponry. And that's what matters. Not to say that we shouldn't invest in quantum or we shouldn't invest in AI. I'm not at all saying that. What I am saying is it just reminds you that we're not fighting Ukraine with Silicon Valley right now. If somebody gives you a really cool liquored up story about a DIU or an OT, ask them when it's going to production, ask them how many numbers, ask them what the APOC is going to be, ask them will it work against China, okay? Ask them all those questions, because that's what matters. And don't tell me it's got AI and quantum in it. I don't care.
But it doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize that powerful AI systems
if they existed, would be a definitive military technology. So much so that, you could imagine that nuclear deterrence doesn't even really matter in a world where you have advanced AI systems. They can do superhuman hacking, you have autonomous drone swarms, you have full situational awareness, you develop biological weapons. Everyone within the DoD, everyone within the national security community in the United States would need to strongly understand, grok, and realize that it is a Manhattan Project level sort of technological capability. I don't know. Chris, care to thoughts, reflections on what those two sort of mindsets and visions of the future tell you?
Well, I think it's, there's clearly a tension between those two views. And I think that tension reflects accurately the tension on the E-Rain between the view that traditional weapon systems still have incredible relevance in Ukraine and in other places. At the same time, as we talk about in the book, when we visited Ukraine, it was just astonishing to see the kind of digital overlay that have been built around artillery, tanks, trenches, things that have been around in warfare for a very long time. And it really is going to be the synthesis of these two things where I think you're going to see new combat power really kind of resolve and materialize. And so it's not an either or, it's sort of a both, I think, that we need to get to. And we need, we're only going to get there by talking through it. And Ukraine, in many respects, as horrific as a human disaster it's been for both Russia and Ukraine, it's been a real wake-up call on a number of fronts. And importantly, I think it's showing that we are indeed in an era of hybrid war, where the new and the old are working together now in a new way. And I think that's tremendously informative to where we take the department, where the department takes itself in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that Bill LaPlante sort of misses in that quote specifically is the idea that, all the sort of technological overlay that, all the software and hardware engineers in Ukraine and around the world have been able to bring to that side of the fight is almost like table stakes in order for you to play the more attritional traditional game where like you're bringing out the Maxim guns and old dumb artillery shells, and they're still really important to the sort of balance of forces. And we're clearly not in the world of Alex Wong's future imagining where like all you need is like great technology and like you'll be able to win costless victories. But to sort of completely dismiss the role that the tech bros are playing, I think is also really missing what the present and the future is going to look like.
I mean, the reality is the tech bros have more processing power in their game consoles, right, than Bill LaPlante has in most of the systems he's responsible for deploying. So and that takes us back, to the cover of Unit X, which features an F-35 and an iPhone. And, those two devices are the epitome of the two separate systems of technological production that we have. An F-35 whose design requirements were finalized in 2001, the year the Pentagon awarded the production contract to Lockheed Martin, even though the F-35 didn't become fully operational until 2016. So here you have an aircraft, flying down the runway who has already been flown by the technological state of the art, in the sense that by 2016, you already have the fifth generation of the iPhone out. We're now just about into iPhone 16 territory. And yet the operational F-35s today don't even have quad-core processors in them. So, there's an incredible opportunity to take the system of production that builds goods for the consumer economy and to merge it with the system of production that presently produces most of our weapon systems. And if we're successful in doing that, if Bill LaPlante is successful in helping oversee that, we will end up with far more powerful systems than we have today.
So one of the things I appreciated you writing about is the toll that these jobs take on the people who take them and like want to do them well.
It was just such a privilege to serve, first in the Pentagon, before that actually in Iraq, work for NASA for a year, and then spent some time on the National Security Council before coming out to run Defense Innovation Unit, which was my last federal posting. I was a holdover appointee into the Trump administration and stepped down in the fall of 2017. And I when I left DIU, I was pretty sure I was done with full-time public service. 13 years, 13 exceptional years, but also 13 really excruciating and exhausting years. And I kind of realized just what I had been through. The semester after I left DIU, I got a chance to go back to my alma mater, Harvard, and teach a class of undergraduates. And I was at Harvard exactly 20 years after I was a freshman there, which is a great reminder that I am not indeed just out of college, because I arrived and I wasn't sure whether my students were undergraduates or in high school, because they look so young. But they were wonderful. They were just so wonderful. And it was great to be around them and to see the world through their eyes, to teach them some things and to answer their questions. And all of them, many of them took the class I taught because they had aspirations of going to work in Washington and in national security. And I kind of, and I can understand from their perspective, here they're seeing their teacher, and in my office, there's, pictures of me with President Obama. There's pictures of me flying on government jets, and doesn't it all look so amazing and wonderful? But I had to sit down and one-on-one in office hours tell them, it is wonderful, and you get to work on incredibly important problems that have such important ramifications for our world. And you really do get to use your mind and your brain to help people come to better decisions. I mean, it's so gratifying, right, to train as a political scientist and actually be able to use your skills to make the world a better place. But at the same time, as I told my students, there's a lot of things you can't unsee. And one of the things I would tell them is, I used to get an email before every U.S. drone strike, target window weapons platform. And, in these jobs, you tend to see a lot of things that you can't unsee. And I think any human, when they're faced, whether in uniform or a civilian serving in some of these positions, when they're faced with this being their day-to-day, it does take a toll. And so that weighed on me, and that was part of the reason when I left Defense Innovation Unit that I was almost positive I would never go back into government. But of course, you never say never. And the day that I was most tempted happened to be the day a former boss of mine, Ron Klein, was announced to be the next president's chief of staff. And I really admire Ron. He's such an incredible public servant. And I thought long and hard, maybe I should go back in. And the story I tell in the book is that I called my oldest mentor, a person who knows me so well, and she asked 3 questions. The conversation took all of 3 minutes. She asked, what do you actually remember about the last time you were working in the White House? And I said, well, I remember driving home at around 2 a.m, being so tired, all I was trying to do was not crash my car in Rock Creek Parkway. And then she asked, how long ago was your divorce finalized? And, I said, about a year. I was with my first husband for 13 years and not coincidentally, we separated not long after my time in public service came to an end. And then she asked, the final and most important question, are you ready to leave San Francisco yet? Haven't you just met someone new there? And the answer was no. And then 3 minutes, she had helped me answer the question I had about myself. And I share that story in the book purposely because I think it is important for people to realize what it means to serve in national security and how there are joys with that service, but there are also burdens.
So, thinking back about your sort of experience, I mean, you can't really organizationally design a way to, people not being part of killing other people in a defense department. But I'm sort of curious on some other dimensions of the challenges that these sorts of roles pose to people personally. Like, when you read stories of George Marshall playing golf in the afternoon during World War II or something, like what percentage of, hour 12 to 16 of a day, actually needed to be there versus this sort of thing that, like, if the whole place just ran better, then the people in it might be able to sustain themselves for longer.
Well, I'll say one thing, and then I'll tell a story. And the thing I'll say is that you're part of a system, and you are part of a team. I mean, it's not just you, right? You're working with other people. There are people below you, on both sides of you. You're reporting to people more senior than you, and collectively, you're trying to help people at the very top of the department make the absolute best decisions that they can. And because those decisions are often so consequential, you really do want to try your best to provide the best information, the best analysis that you possibly can. And that's why I think it's hard to go home at 5:30 when you're in one of these jobs, because you simply don't want to do anything but your best. But there, in addition to the tough days where a lot of things go wrong and you have to deal with some really unpleasant things in the world, there are also some incredible days. And I'll just tell you one. I got a chance, because I was kind of like the science nerd on General Dempsey's staff, the tech guy. One of the things that he asked me to look at very closely was Ebola. Back when Ebola was a small outbreak in West Africa that the WHO was maintaining was completely being controlled under the ordinary procedures that are used to contain Ebola outbreaks. But General Dempsey, being, again, a curious and wise leader and somebody who had read about epidemics, wanted somebody on his staff to track the situation closely, just in case at some point, if it really became an emergency, he would be prepared to advise the president and the Secretary of Defense on what capabilities the military might have to help. And, fast forward a few months, we went from a small outbreak to an outbreak that actually threatened global security. And thanks in part to the incredible pre-planning that a whole group of people in the Department of Defense led that summer of 2014, we actually had options to deliver to the Secretary and the President about how the military could help. And that led to the launch of Operation United Assistance, which deployed 3,500 U.S. service members to support 100,000 medical first responders in West Africa. And that operation ultimately ended the Ebola epidemic. And, late in the outbreak, I got a chance to travel with a White House and USA delegation to West Africa. And I got to meet people there who survived Ebola because of what the U.S. Department of Defense did. And all you could do is hug people and cry because you had done something incredible for them, and frankly for America by helping stave off the threat of a global contagion that would have set us into an economic spiral, possibly even caused us to have to close our borders for Ebola to potentially become endemic. So the job is full of sorrow and joy, and it's all incredibly meaningful. And with any luck, you do a lot of good on the best days and even on the worst days.
So we've had a really interesting arc around sort of like national security and AI labs over the past, 18 months or so, where I think, more and more of the world and also the labs themselves are waking up to the fact that these are, perhaps, one of the more important dual use technologies that are going to matter around the world in the coming years. And, we had Leopold Aschenbrenner write a PDF, and all of a sudden 2 weeks later, General Nakasone shows up on the OpenAI board. And, interestingly, there does seem to be an increasing sort of awareness around issues of lab security and a sort of steadily increasing bifurcation of the Chinese and Chinese and US AI ecosystem. So, I think the sort of current discussion around the people who purport to be like serious about national security and talking about the labs is this assumption that we're going to end up in a world where these things are nationalized, like the like the Manhattan Project, and everything's run out of Los Alamos or something, or the sort of counter argument that like this is just going to be the private sector that ends up doing whatever they want. an interesting middle ground is the arc of the space industry in the U.S. Chris, curious for your thoughts and reflections with that prompt about what lessons, if any, the 20th and 21st century of the space industry has for the future of the relationship between AI labs and the government.
My former colleague at Anthropic, Michael Slido, did make a really interesting observation, which is that the rise of commercial space could actually provide a potential model for how the U.S. government ultimately ends up handling increasingly sophisticated, powerful versions of generative AI in the following way. And it's counterintuitive. And actually, I'll tell one quick story here. I got a chance, my first job out of college, to work on the Space Shuttle Columbia accident investigation. And, space shuttles are incredibly dangerous experimental technology. There's 5,100, if I remember correctly, critical one items on a shuttle. If you lose any one of them, you lose the shuttle and likely the crew. And so the idea when I was working on the Shuttle Columbia accident investigation, that someday a commercial company could on its own successfully launch people into space and bring them home, seemed far-fetched, maybe even insane. It seemed like you needed the full expertise of a government to underwrite that kind of dangerous experiment. And so, I, shaped by that experience, for the next few years, looked with great skepticism at the arrival of commercial space companies like SpaceX. I just thought that they were sort of doomed to fail, that there would be no way to improve upon the engineering baselines that so many brilliant engineers in the government context had labored for decades to achieve. And, I turned out to be wrong. It turns out that SpaceX is wildly more successful at launching things into space safely and at far lower cost than anything the government has ever done, with more or less the same tools that NASA has had all the while along. And the model and how this becomes relevant to AI is that AI is something unlike many other advanced technologies that has grown up almost exclusively, at least generative AI, in the private sector. Of course, after decades of incredible contributions on the research and development front from the federal government, but in terms of who's actually operationalizing it now, it's largely private companies. So, could it be that NASA's model now for more or less outsourcing entirely launch to the private sector and having really no kind of engineering oversight or minimal engineering oversight in the actual operations of spacecrafts, be a model for harnessing as a nation the incredible AI products that are now in the hands of the private sector? Could, in fact, the government bolt onto itself private companies rather than needing to in-house, as some suggest is necessary, AI into itself, whether that's through the national labs or another vehicle?
Yeah. The OpenAI and SpaceX stories are also, I think, fascinating parables of organizational design, right? Where it wasn't like OpenAI had more compute than anyone else in 2017 or 2018, but they had the sort of institutional freedom to take different bets than what was going to happen at Google, or in SpaceX's example, what was going to happen at Boeing or something, and kind of understanding just how much applied science can, it's just sitting waiting to be plucked, I think, is something that a lot of the Department of Defense is not necessarily well set up to take advantage of.
Well, yes, and I think one of the things to point out to those in the AI world who hold up the national labs as a potential model for AI. I mean, the national labs do incredibly important work in many areas, but that said, I mean, I remember one day visiting Lawrence Livermore with Sandy Winnefeld, then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and driving immediately after to Google. And they are two very different places with two very different bases of human capital attached to them. If you were to ask the question, who produces more peer-reviewed publications, Google or the national labs or Lawrence Livermore, my money would be on Google. Now, I might not have the numbers exactly right, but the message here is that the private sector has, for America, proven to be an incredible national advantage. The free market, which has, of course, plenty of excesses, nevertheless, has allowed a flourishing of research and development, particularly in the last 2 decades, that is, just unparalleled. And so we ought to be very careful, knowing that, to decide that a governmental structure is necessarily going to produce the same effect. DIU, we had to struggle so hard to pay advanced AI engineers, half the salary they're getting at a tech company. So, we broke or nearly broke or pushed all the rules in the book as far as we could go. And we still had people convince people to take a 50% pay cut for them and their families to come and work on the Department of Defense's AI mission. So that makes me very cautious around around those who view the national labs as a kind of turnkey solution to importing leading edge tech developed today in the American private sector.
Chris, you have this line, unlike China, we have a system where information flows freely and where competition ensures that the best ideas and products rise to the top. Like, do we?
Well, I think this is the whole point of writing, the book. And my co-author, Raj Shah, who now runs Shield Capital, the first venture capital firm that's dedicated towards looking at companies that can contribute to national security. The defense industrial complex is called the defense industrial complex because it's not a free market. It's not a free market in the sense that none of the major primes are product companies. They respond to a different set of incentives. They are saddled by the Department of Defense and the federal acquisition regulations and the auditing and accounting requirements by a different set of requirements. And so they cannot operate like a Google, a Microsoft, an OpenAI, and they most certainly cannot operate like a startup. And so I think the debate we need to be having at some level is how much of our defense spend do we want to go into institutions that do produce incredible technology, but are very different from free market technology companies? And how much money in the Department of Defense and budget do we want to shift into the real innovation economy that's part of the free market that doesn't have many of the same constraints large primes are saddled with? That's a very fundamental debate, and I think as a country we need to have it.
Ultimately, this debate is going to get cashed out in Congress. What is it going to take for Congress to see the world in your way, Chris?
Well, I think the good news is that, since Raj Shah and I were, as we talk about in the book, on day 2 of our jobs, saddled with the knowledge that Congress had just cut our entire budget, the whole thing, and that unless we hustled and really pulled a rabbit out of a hat, DIU would no longer cease to exist come the next fiscal year. There's been a real swing of support towards the idea that the right thing for the Department of Defense to do is to access Silicon Valley and more technology from it. And in fact, in this last year's NDAA, we see actually Defense Innovation Unit get codified in law, both the institution itself and its reporting structure directly to the secretary. And not only did that get codified in law, but Congress bestowed upon Defense Innovation Unit a budget of just under $1 billion, which is really exceptional. So I think there's a lot more awareness now in Congress and consensus around the idea that it's long time for the Department of Defense to access more of the innovation economy. But at the same time, I think it's important to note, as we do in the book, that even though we made such tremendous progress, it's still a very small portion of the Department of Defense budget today that goes to the new defense economy. And unless we change that, I think we're going to increasingly find ourselves surprised by what's happening in Ukraine, surprised by Hezbollah's use of loitering munitions to depopulate northern Israel, surprised as Israel was by Hamas using quadcopters to knock down the Israeli border towers and have over 1,000 fighters pour over a kind of modern day Maginot Line. So we kind of ignore this debate, I think, very much at our own peril.
Chris, you've decided to go work at Anthropic. I'm curious, I assume someone would give you a job in the, emerging defense tech ecosystem. Why were you more interested in working at a lab?
I just finished a wonderful policy residency at Anthropic, and I really enjoyed my time there this spring. And I actually got to work there on a number of national security issues, both policy issues and issues of practice with Anthropic's AI safety team, something called their Frontier Red Team. And I'm really excited actually to keep working generally in this area because I think the impacts of generative AI on American military capability is going to be tremendous, and that there are many opportunities, but also many risks that need to be managed. So I think there's a lot more work to do in AI and national security. And once I'm done with my book tour, I wouldn't be surprised if I end up keep working on that set of issues.
Let's go to some book recommendation. What should we take from that shelf of yours?
I do have a lot of books. I much to my partner's chagrin, I keep collecting more of them. Let me give you 3 recommendations. They're books a little bit outside. Well, 2 of the 3 books are outside the kind of military genre, but I'll explain why I chose them anyway. The first it's called Tracers in the Dark: The Global Hunt for Crime Lords of Cryptocurrency. It's by Andy Greenberg. It came out a couple of years ago, and it's a absolutely page-turning barn burner of a story of crypto lords who are trying to hide their tracks from law enforcement and the FBI agents in hot pursuit of them. And I like it because fundamentally it's a story about state sovereignty in a technological age, answering the question of, does the state actually have the capacity or does it not have the capacity to enforce the rule of law as people use just invented technology that has an incredible sophistication to it to avoid notice and avoid things like the tax structure and potentially to do very illegal and harmful things with the money they're trafficking in. It's a great read. You will tear through it. You won't be able to go to bed. Tracers in the Dark. The second book that really impressed me, it was just so deeply meaningful to read, is called Say Nothing, and it's by Patrick Radden Keefe, the New Yorker writer. And it's about the Troubles in Ireland. And, Irish history was, of course I had heard about the Troubles, but I didn't really have much context for it. So I was just astonished to read this incredible history, which is based off a new history, actually, of the conflict, a new oral history, a set of interviews that had never before been accessed by a journalist. And it paints this heartbreaking picture of violence between 2 groups of people that were sorting out the dynamics of their political institutions and ultimately who would rule whom. And, it was a little bit like realizing that the United Kingdom had gone through its own version of Iraq, and that Ireland, in a strange way, was kind of like Al Anbar. And the British military literally had to try and come in and pacify things. But of course, in the process of pacifying violence, they used violence of their own in ways that turned the people even more against them. So it was absolutely fascinating to read about that kind of conflict, the kind of conflict that certainly I associate with the Iraq War, having served as a civilian in Iraq, and realize it actually happened in the United Kingdom not too many years before the Iraq War. So in terms of the sociology of violence and the sociology of conflict, it's a tremendous read. And then the last book, which I'm sure many people who listen to ChinaTalk are familiar with, is Malcolm Gladwell's Bomber Mafia, which is an incredible book, actually, not so much to read, but to listen to, because Malcolm Gladwell started it out meaning it to be a podcast, an audio experience, and then realized there was enough substance to the story. It was such an incredible story, he actually wanted to turn it into a book. And so the audio version kind of melds those 2 formats in a really interesting way. And it's just, classic Gladwell, really vivid portraits of characters and seeing history through their eyes and learning to have sympathy for their positions. In the bombing campaign, the American Air Force and Army led in the Second World War in both the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters, where not just hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives, but millions did. So I highly, highly recommend that read as a historically rooted episode of people just like today struggling with innovation, with the limits of the possible, and with what is acceptable in the conduct of war as two nations are engaged in an awful conflict that despite many attempts, could not have been avoided.
Chris, thank you so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Great to be here, Jordan.